Earlier this month, Israel's spy agency Mossad made an explosive announcement that they'd worked in conjunction with Brazilian police to foil a Hezbollah terror plot. Soon after this, the Brazilian police made the unusual move of telling the Israelis to fuck off and stated that the plot they had foiled had no involvement with international events. While many laughed, others brought up the 1994 AMIA bombing in Buenos Aires, Argentina, as proof that there must be something to Israel's accusations. Being an Amerifat who lost his ability to consistently read and comprehend Spanish due to my past membership at a kickboxing gym where sparring happened 4 days a week, I can't claim to have ever read a ton about the AMIA attack, only surface-level things like the suicide of Special Prosecutor Alberto Nisman, the claims of Hezbollah/Iranian involvement, and the way that this alleged involvement has been used by American neoconservatives to point to a broader Iranian operation in Latin America. But luckily for all of us, we're joined today by this show's first ever Jewish Latino guest, Twitter's and Substack's I Write for Jacobin, who also happens to have written an excellent 3-part series on the bombing and the tangled mess that has since followed. How are you doing today, Stef?
I'm good.
So, just for our listeners who are not super familiar with the attacks and in general not super familiar with Argentinian history in the 20th century, could you give some context for what it was like for the Jewish community in Argentina, both during the dictatorship and sort of right before the bombing?
So during the dictatorship's repression was primarily directed against the left and specifically against the Peronist left and the Marxist left. And I don't, to some extent, the disproportionate number of Jews who were targeted or tortured were, was of course a result of just disproportionate Jewish representation in left-wing movements in general. But according to Jacobo Timerman and who wrote a famous book about his experiences under torture during the dictatorship. There was a specific question that Jewish, leftist detainees would be asked frequently, which was about information about something called La Plan Andina, the Andina Plan. Andina Plan. This comes up later in Strange Revelations about the AMIA bombing, but it's essentially a conspiracy based on when Theodore Herzl wanted to create Israel in Argentina that states that there's sort of a joint Zionist left-wing conspiracy to take Patagonia from Argentina and Chile and create a second Israel there. So in the dictatorship era, this was like, oh, Soviet and Israeli troops are going to land any day now. Like we have to, this is like an urgent, real national security threat. It persisted into democracy, but, that's like a deeply bizarre aspect of anti-Semitism in the Argentine dictatorship that I don't think a lot of people realize is that yes, it was also that they were sort of Catholic, hardcore Catholic, anti-communist, but there was sort of a very specific belief there, however strange it was.
Yeah, no, that kind of struck me in some of the materials you sent me, how little anti-Semitism in Argentina was discussed just in the context of the bombing at large. I thought that was a pretty stark omission in at least American sources about this.
Yeah, I mean, just to say something in connection with that, Argentina, I mean, this is not something we can get into here, but, Perón allowed these various, World War II war criminals to take refuge in Argentina. And so there's this, Americans don't really know who Perón was or what Peronism is, and it's hard to explain. But Perón also got on pretty well with the Jewish community in Argentina. It's part of his general schizophrenic sort of outlook on everything. Whereas the anti-Peronist right is where anti-Semitism historically comes from in Argentina, not even under the dictatorship, but prior to Perón, when the first sort of progressive movement in Argentine national history, UCR, the Radical Civic Union, was in power briefly. A lot of the elite reaction against those governments involved attacks on synagogues and so on, just because. So, I don't know, again, all of the people who did that stuff, all of their descendants love Israel now. And Israel armed the Argentine dictatorship, of course, famously. But that is sort of, to me, that's sort of the really relevant legacy of anti-Semitism in Argentina, more than like Peron's like weird little retirement home for Nazis.
Yeah. You've written a lot about how muddled the investigation has been, but to the best of your abilities, could you give what is the consensus best recounting of events of the actual attack?
So on July 18th, 1994, the AMIA, which stands for, is the main building of Asociación Mutual Israelí Argentina, which is like the Argentine Israelite Mutual Association. It's like a Jewish community group. Exploded, 85 people were killed. The what happened has never been conclusively proven, but has never, like, literally has not been proven. Like, it's a cold case. But the consensus narrative in both like North American and in Argentine society and media is that this was a Hezbollah suicide bombing, which there are a number of problems with. I think also important to note is that the AMIA bombing happened 2 years after the bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, which killed fewer people and like is sort of more I feel like people are more dismissive towards, just because it's like, oh, well, the Hezbollah explanation kind of makes sense there. Like, that's like an Israeli political target. But that event is also like deeply odd. And I personally don't believe that Hezbollah or Iran was responsible for it. But regardless, there's a lot of unanswered questions around that too. And it sort of kicked off the whole processes that the AMIA would then really kick into overdrive.
Yeah, that is the thing that I, have repeatedly run into in my limited reading of this. Like, just how weird it would be for Hezbollah to seemingly, like, at random select Argentina, and how convoluted, like on the other hand, how convoluted like a false flag attack would be. Could you talk a little bit about the immediate aftermath of the bombing and sort of the U.S.'s role through the FBI in pushing the Iran theory forward?
Yeah, so in the immediate aftermath of the bombing, a couple of things happened. One to note, that's recorded in Gabriel Levinas's great book, La Ley Bajo los Escombros, The Law Under the Rubble, is a reporter for Radio Mitre, which is like a major, or at least at the time was a major Argentine radio station, is live on air, like right after the bombing happens, like as the police are supposed to be pulling people out from under the rubble. And he sees a group of men affiliated either with the federal police or with CIDE, the intelligence agency, like picking up, like carrying around a bunch of auto parts, and interviews them live on air. And they're like, oh, these are parts of the suicide van that we just like already found at the scene. Like as rescue efforts are going on, like before the investigation is even started. And that sort of tracks into, what happens further and further on. So like, whatever you make of this, an Israeli forensic team is immediately flown in to examine the AMIA. This, I mean, to be sure, this probably has partially to do with the fact that like the Argentine police, especially the Buenos Aires municipal police, were just like not very experienced in these types of things. But it's still odd. Then there's a couple of teams from the U.S. There's FBI, which is sort of consistently involved in the later investigation. And then there's also an ATF team. The ATF team is notable only because I think his name is Charles Hunter, the chief ATF investigator, is skeptical of the suicide bomb version. And I'm not an explosives expert, but his reasoning is like, none of the surrounding buildings were damaged. None of the surrounding buildings had their windows blown out. Like, this seems like an explosion that came from within the building. There are other reasons to be suspicious of this suicide bomb version of events. But in any case, that is the version of events that eventually sort of everyone runs with, and that, conditions Nisman's investigation, and before that, the investigations in attempts to prove like there was a bomb explosion from a vehicle that drove into the building, and the driver was a member of Hezbollah or affiliated to Iran or Lebanese or what have you.
Yeah, I noticed that a lot of, I mean, it's already just like very thin evidence, if you could call it that, for Iranian involvement. We'll link to the 3-part series that you wrote, but in that you talk about how a lot of the evidence for Hezbollah or Iranian links is in like sort of very bad early 90s phone analysis, like I forget what the exact like intelligence term for it is, but just like connecting phones basically.
Yeah,
And there's one suspect that they think that they fingered at one point, who Mohsen Rabbani, who, like you note, also had died months before this attack, but they basically pinned it on him in preliminary investigations by pointing out that like a phone call made in the area of Buenos Aires that he lived in called the van company that supplied the van purportedly used in the attack.
yeah. So there's sort of three different incarnations of the Iran guilt theory, and we'll go through each of those. But just maybe to preface this is all the like you mentioned the United States' role in sort of pushing this narrative and Israel's role in pushing this narrative, and of course, like they were the beneficiaries, but as we saw by sort of how clumsy the like Brazil thing was, whoever's in charge of Israel's Latin America, the Mossad's Latin America desk, or in charge of the FBI's, like, there's definitely Hezbollah in Latin America desk, is like is essentially like Cersei Lannister with that once Tywin dies. And the Tywin in this case is a man with the most Guess Who ass super spy alias of all time called Aldo Style, whose real name, who will later be known as Jaime Stiuso, and whose real name is Antonio Horacio Stiuso, who not only spends his entire career, but his entire adult life pretty much as the sort of power behind the throne of La CIDE, the Argentine like foreign intelligence agency. So, like for instance, when the Israeli embassy bombing first happens, Stiuso's man in Tel Aviv, this guy named Patricio Finin, like goes to Mossad and is like, CIDE can prove that there was a suicide bomb, and you should like run this through us. You should give all your resources to us. Like, we're your guys on the ground in Argentina. Like, and that's sort of the beginning of a very fruitful relationship for Stiuso and CIDE with the U.S. and Israel and with various European intelligence agencies, which goes great until it doesn't in 2014.
All right. So now that you've sort of established Stiuso, could you give our listeners a brief tour into the personal and political life of a man whose career Stiuso patronized, Alberto Nisman, the prosecutor?
Yeah, so Nisman is like Stiuso's pawn, or Stiuso is Nisman's like daddy. I don't know how else to really put it. And there's consciousness of this in Argentina. There's like, there's also stuff that you'll see, like if you search like, Nisman Sionismo or Nisman Mossad or something, Nisman CIA on Twitter, there'll be people who are like, oh, Nisman was like a Mossad agent and he was working for American imperialism. But Nisman was like a pawn in the game of Jaime Stiuso. And basically Nisman's, he starts out as a young lawyer. There's some odd stuff in his early career. Like he barely escapes being prosecuted for making obscene phone calls, like very obscene phone calls to one of his female colleagues. And then he becomes head of the AMIA investigation eventually, and his entire rest of his career and his life really will center on this. So he becomes a very prestigious person who receives all of his information that he uses in the investigation through Stiuso. And he also gets like a lot of personal benefits out of this relationship. So like one of Stiuso's biggest assets in sort of marketing himself politically or making himself indispensable to politicians in democratic Argentina was his network in the court system. So Stiuso gets Nisman's wife appointed to a federal judgeship that she's like, not even in the running for. And Nisman becomes quite wealthy. He travels and sort of is prestigious internationally. Like there's various videos you can find on YouTube of him speaking to Foundation for Defense of Democracies in particular. He does speak through a translator, but yeah, and there's a lot of weirdness around Nisman's finances that we'll probably ultimately never know the answer to. Like he had a secret, as was revealed immediately after his death, he had a secret bank account in the U.S. which was receiving, $10,000, $15,000 deposits, pretty regularly from unknown individuals. His IT guy, Diego Lagomarsino, gave Nisman half his salary at the end of every month, who will also be a suspect in Nisman's death. So there's he's sort of like, the way I think of Nisman is he's sort of like a sort of playboy lawyer type who's like, he's Jewish and he comes from, a pro-Israel background as I do and as all Argentine Jews do. But like he's really a pawn in the game of someone who's not Jewish and, sort of a subcontractor for Mossad and the CIA.
So let's establish the timeline for sort of right before Nisman kills himself and then does. So what happened with Stiuso, Christina Kirchner, and then Nisman's investigation? Because you characterize his ultimate set of accusations as sort of like a desperate move to save this very lucrative career that he's made for himself.
Yeah. So now we could probably get into like the three different incarnations of the AMIA Hezbollah guilt theory. So the first one is, as you said, then makes a series of, does this really dubious like phone link analysis, connecting like someone in Buenos Aires called someone in Paraguay, who called someone in Lebanon, who was we think was involved with Hezbollah. James Bernazzani, the FBI liaison to CIDE, who, is fully invested in proving the Iran theory, famously said that this is like dangerous and you could link his phone to Osama bin Laden's with this methodology. But yeah, so CIDE makes a series of claims centered around that. And then a lot of the specific individuals who are calling on each end are sort of murky, but one is, as you said, Mohsen Rabbani, the cultural attaché to the Iranian embassy in Argentina, who purchased a white Renault traffic van several months before the attack. And because it's alleged that a white Renault traffic van was the suicide van, is like, oh, he purchased this on behalf of the attack, like the Iranian embassy was involved in planning the attack. And, the phone stuff on Rabbani's end is especially, like murky. Like, CIDE alleges that like a call was made to a Hezbollah linked number, or a call was linked to a number that called a Hezbollah linked number from like near Rabbani's rental apartment, which like, yeah. The other thing that CIDE does in this first phase is arrest a man named Carlos Deshedin, who's a very weird guy. He's a used car salesman, wheeler dealer, Lebanese Argentine man who has connections to different like low-level corrupt Buenos Aires cops, and his wife is like a prostitute. There's some kind of like sex work linkage to this that is not entirely clear to me. But they arrest Deshedin, and this begins like a whole like really horrendous legal odyssey for him, where for years he's being hounded through the courts. And ultimately, he's completely exonerated of everything. But one thing that's interesting about that is that, like, when he's first arrested, a CIDE agent comes to him and is like, we're going to give you $400,000 if you, like, say the names of the Hezbollah operatives who committed the attack. Which, of course, even if that was the suicide van, like, Deshedin just sold a used car. Like, he so of course he couldn't do that. And he sort of gets pursued through the courts. You mentioned the name of the suspect. Rabbani is still alive. He's can't leave Iran for somewhat obvious reasons. But the actual name of the suspect is a guy named Ibrahim Hussein Barrow, the alleged suicide bomber. So we could get into like the second. This is like already into the second incarnation of like the AMIA Hezbollah thesis.
Yeah. Just run through all of them.
Yeah, so Nisman claims in the early 2000s that that this Hezbollah, like this driver who defected, this Hezbollah defector who was like a driver for Nasrallah or for Imad Mugniya or someone, identified identified Hezbollah's guilt in the attack, and identified the suicide bomber as someone whose last name was like Bru or Barrow. And so Nisman alleges that this was a man named Ibrahim Hussein Barrow, whose funeral in Lebanon was attended by high-ranking Hezbollah like figures. I'm not sure if it was Nasrallah himself or Munir or like someone else whose name I don't know. But the primary guilt, like the primary evidence of guilt against Barrow is that, these guys wouldn't have come to his funeral unless he, carried out some important, mission for Hezbollah. Yeah. So then Nisman and Stiuso locate Barrow's brothers who are in Detroit, which is I find the image of them heading to Detroit together very funny. But they take DNA samples from the brothers. The DNA samples were never tested. Supposedly they're eventually lost. So there's ultimately this, the Barrow thing is sort of, again, this is now the official story, but it sort of goes nowhere. The third incarnation of the AMIA Hezbollah guilt thesis, once Nisman sort of is making this grand accusation against Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, comes entirely from Brazilian MEK sources. So I think he has like 7 like Iranian Brazilian exiles who are in some way affiliated with MEK, like go on the record and be like, oh yeah, like we knew about the plot, like, these figures in Iran were calling these people like here in Brazil, and they were, arranging the whole thing. So that last one is obviously the most doubtful, and I think it sort of speaks to the increasing desperation that surrounds like Nisman in his last few years and last few months.
And why was Nisman so desperate? Could you talk a little bit about Stiuso's firing and Nisman's personal fears that he was speaking to close friends in the days and weeks before the suicide?
Yeah, so Nisman is very stressed out. His friends describe him as like very frantic in the months before. He's traveling all over the place. He's sending like these cryptic WhatsApp messages to his friends. And he is working on this indictment against Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, the great pink tide figure of Argentina. So what this indictment has to do with is that I forget the year, I think 2011, Argentina and Iran sign a memorandum of understanding, which would have Argentine prosecutors interview the relevant Iranian suspects in Iran. And the two countries will sort of work together to get to the truth of this. The rationale for Iran here is that these figures, who include like very senior, like ex-political functionaries and stuff, are under Interpol red alerts, which means that if they leave Iran, any country that wants to, like, can and should arrest them. And Iran wants to get these lifted. Nisman makes the argument that, in fact, there's no intention to get to the truth behind the Memorandum of Understanding. And in fact, the entire point of this is just to exonerate the Iranian officials without justice ever being done. And so as he sort of starts working on this kind of, in rushed fashion. And a lot of it does have to do with Stiuso is being shuffled out of SIDA in 2014. Nisman is losing like his guy, like his patron, and is very, like, we know from what's been released of like his friends that have gone on the record and stuff, that he's extremely fearful about losing his own job and his own career. On top of which, he's very fearful about, once he lost Stiuso and that protection, the political fallout, the like just sheer like hatred that would come down on him from like the then dominant like Kirchnerist left in Congress and stuff. And so he starts preparing this accusation. Now, by the time Nisman, in the days before Nisman dies, Stiuso has stopped picking up his phone calls from Nisman, which no doubt like added greatly to, his general feeling of panic. And the primary person pushing Nisman to present this in front of Congress is Patricia Bullrich, who is a far-right politician, but who is like still like the mainstream right-wing candidate in the first round of the elections that just happened, who's like just extraordinarily fail. Like I encourage anyone, like if you're a Spanish speaker and you like want to, get a measure of Patricia Bullrich, I would encourage you to look up her Rosh Hashanah greetings video that she filmed from an RV driving across Tucumán province, or her campaign ad for building Dr. Cristina Fernández de Kirchner Memorial Prison.
Esta cárcel va a ser diferente a todo lo que tenemos hasta ahora, con inhibidores de señal telefónica, sin celulares, vigilancia individualizada, una guardia incorruptible y tolerancia cero. El futuro es con los delincuentes y corruptos presos de verdad. Es ahora y es para siempre.
So Nisman is already like the people supporting him are like the crazy edge of the right wing already, from where he had like this all-powerful Stiuso figure previously.
Yeah, and I thought it was incredibly weird that Stiuso happened to flee Argentina after being questioned following Nisman's suicide. He fled to America, and has he returned in that time?
He has returned, and that gets even weirder. But yeah, so Stiuso, immediately after Nisman's death, Stiuso leaves Argentina. He goes to an undisclosed location in the U.S. I think he said in some interview that it was somewhere in California. I don't know, but there's a rift between Argentina and the U.S. because Argentina wants to question Stiuso and or charge him, and the Obama administration totally stonewalls any like Argentine requests about this. And this gets like the U.S. denounced before the UN by like the Argentine relevant representatives there, and all sorts of things like that. In 2016, after Mauricio Macri, the like sort of hard right neoliberal candidate, wins the elections, Stiuso does return to Argentina, and his life since then is sort of characterized by these like very rare but very like weird media appearances he makes like once or twice a year, where he'll say stuff like, oh, there were people affiliated with the Kirchners like tracking me before Nisman died, and like they threatened the lives of me and my daughters. I fled Argentina in fear of my life, which is like overall the Kirchners, who's like, machine left-wing politicians whose like networks are like in activist movements and in the unions and in like local political machines. I don't really, this doesn't seem very credible. In fact, for like spy stuff, they relied on Stiuso for years, which was because he was the guy you went to for that. But yeah, he says that he testifies a bunch of times in the Nisman case, and he keeps wanting to testify more times. Like he keeps asking to be allowed to testify again. The most recently, I think, was like either last or this year. And he basically is like, yeah, like Cristina Kirchner assassinated Nisman, and like it's a whole, Nisman was right. It's all a big conspiracy to cover up Iran's guilt in the attacks. I would encourage, again, any Spanish speakers to watch. Like there are some like floating around clips from Stiuso's interviews, both on Argentine TV and for this very weird Netflix documentary series, which I would encourage people to watch because he's like very smug, very cryptic. He keeps doing these like huge, broad, like Cheshire cat grins. And like, just dancing around like, I know more than I'm letting on. In terms of what else Stiuso does, he founds a consulting company, as all ex-intelligence officials are wont to do, which is a combination security and nutrition consulting firm because his wife is a nutritionist. And he also makes odd media appearances. He gets offered, because of that Netflix documentary, Netflix offers him the position of an advisor on that show, Fauda, like the like Mossad propaganda.
Oh, yeah,
like,
the Homeland type show.
Yeah, which I could find nothing on whether or not he accepted that offer or not, but he did get it.
You go to great lengths in your series about sort of explaining that, for the same reasons why it's very unlikely that Hezbollah or Iran did this, why it's very unlikely that like this is a false flag attack by Israel or the U.S. Like, again, like why would they need to, like Argentina just isn't on many Americans' minds at all. Why would they do it there, et cetera? But could you talk a little bit about why the U.S. is so interested in this and sort of the U.S.'s interest in the tri-border region?
Yeah. So the first thing is, what I personally believe about this is that this was not done as a false flag. And that could be like, sort of my, arguing too much with Sean McCarthy, like anti-conspiracy biases. But it did become it was a retroactive false flag. So in other words, the people who did this created a fantastic opportunity for someone much smarter than them, Jaime Stiuso, to sort of form this very beneficial relationship with the U.S. and Israeli intelligence agencies. But yeah, so the argument around Hezbollah, Paraguay, sort of goes back to this whole discourse, which Stiuso is really the father after the 1992 Israeli embassy bombing, about how in the tri-border area, which is like basically where the borders of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay meet, it's like not a it's like a rural sort of swampy place. Iguazu Falls are there, I guess, if you think that's cool. But there are a lot of like Lebanese and Syrian immigrants there. There are in Argentina and South America in general. And Stiuso sort of starts making the case that these people are like that Hezbollah is like somewhere embedded here. And because this is sort of like a, anarchic, like cross-border region, which like no one, really has under their firm control, that like, all kinds of gun runners and terrorists and whatnot are moving there. And in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, Stiuso even attempts to sell to the U.S. that bin Laden is hiding in Paraguay, which not even the Bush administration takes that bait. But it's difficult, it's difficult to sort of go. I personally don't like a lot of like left-wing explanations for like why the U.S. cares so much about this region, just because they're sort of very deterministic. They're like, so like the second largest aquifer in the world is here, and huge, like very fertile agricultural land. And like, that's, famously sort of a bit of a testing ground for like Monsanto and all these, and GMOs and all of these sort of like multinationals. And like lithium is there, and there's all these resources. I think that's probably part of the story. I think a bigger part of the story is if you look at a map, the US's imperial satrap in Latin America is like first and foremost Colombia, which is all the way in the far north of the country. So if you want like to do stuff in the South American landmass, if you want to do stuff in the Southern Cone, like Colombia doesn't really cut it. And I think this is all connected to U.S. efforts to sort of establish a presence in the tri-border region, which have been most successful concerning Paraguay, but the general like AMIA discourse, threat construction has been a huge part of legitimizing even like those bases and such that exist outside Argentina.
Mm-hmm. And that region has a lot of Middle Eastern diaspora as well, right?
Yeah.
One of the more interesting things that you sent me was the story of this guy, who was he was a spy for the cops in Argentina, Jose Alberto Perez. He was undercover in the Jewish community in Argentina at the time of the bombing, or before the bombing. Could you talk a little bit about his accusations?
Yeah, so Yosi, or he called himself Yosi, went undercover. This is the best like link for Argentine state actors being involved in the attack. But basically, Perez's story is that he was sent undercover during democracy by his bosses within the federal police, who were dictatorship holdovers who wanted to sort of, make sure the left didn't resurge, but also were interested in what we mentioned at the top of the show, which is La Planandina, and wanted sort of him to, go into Jewish institutions and find the secret plans to take over Patagonia. And Perez played this role for some years. He visited the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires regularly. He also specifically alleges that his bosses in the federal police had plans for the AMIA building, and that he's quite certain that it was an explosion that came from within the building. And this is all strengthened by the fact that one of the many suspicious things that happened the day of the attack is that the federal police, who are normally around the AMIA, as guards or whatever, are conspicuously absent in the hours right before the attack. And so there's all kinds of, even in sort of the mainstream account, there's all kinds of stuff that's state actors were complicit in this, and that actually backs up the, bizarre Kirchner Iran cover-up theory. But the problem with this is that, as we know from Perez, and as we know from sort of in general, the federal police was the preserve of very right-wing, anti-Peronist, dictatorship holdover elements. And so if you want a theory of what happened, I think one possible theory of what happened is that's very realistic, but we may never know for sure, is that these right-wing elements of the federal police were responsible for the attack, and that, these sort of right-wing meatheads just gave like the perfect chance to Jaime Stiuso to like, make it big off of this. I'd encourage people, there's actually some reporting about this in English. I'd encourage people to read Gareth Porter's stuff at the Gray Zone. The other weird addendum to the story is that there's an Amazon original series made about Jose Perez called Yosi, the Regretful Spy, which I believe is subtitled, which narrates all of these events. And so like implicitly cast doubt on like, or at least says there's something more going on than the Iran thesis. But it got like really rave reviews in the right-wing Jewish press, reviews that were like, oh, this shows how like the Argentine state was conspiring against Jews, which is like, yes, but not the elements of the Argentine state that you're thinking of.
That's very interesting. So like almost 20 years, almost 30 years after the fact now, is this still something that like people outside the Jewish community in Argentina even like talk about anymore, or is it just sort of like in the wind, more or less?
It got kicked very much back into public consciousness by Nisman's death, which we haven't totally talked about yet. But I don't want to say it's like the dominant mythology of like the Argentine right or the defining thing. But like in the last debates, Javier Milei, the lunatic like libertarian TikTok psycho candidate, brought up, they killed Nisman to insulate himself from accusations that he's anti-democratic because he's an apologist for the dictatorship and for the generals. So it's definitely still there. And, it sort of gets trotted out in the demonization of the left and of the Kirchner specifically as like, they committed the worst crime against democracy. Like they assassinated the guy who was going to expose all of their Iran plotting. And, I think that's important. I mean, my family who are from the Jewish community were very like tuned up about Nisman when it happened. And, to this day are still pretty like, it's still pretty big in their minds. They're like, oh, like, CFK is una asesina, like she killed him. And, it's all an anti-Semitic, like Venezuela, Bolivia, Hezbollah, all the enemies of like the West and Israel are like teamed up against Argentine Jews. But I mean, it's not the driver of like Milei's campaign. It's just of note that it does get its deployment is sort of definitely still a feature on the Argentine right.
A prominent Argentine prosecutor has been found dead in his apartment hours before he was set to testify before a congressional panel. He had been aiming to open an investigation into the country's president. Our Shasta Darlington is live from Sao Paulo, Brazil with more. And Shasta, what a shocking discovery. What are the details?
Absolutely, Linda. It's a real mystery here. This is the special prosecutor, Alberto Nisman, who just last week accused the president of Argentina, Cristina Kirchner, of covering up Iran's involvement in the bombing of a Jewish center 20 years ago. And now on Sunday afternoon, just hours before he was going to give some testimony on these allegations, they found his body blocking the bathroom door with a .22 caliber gun and a shell casing next to his body.
And how do most people see Nisman's death? Like, you're pretty confident that it's a suicide, and going off what you wrote, I am too. But how do people generally see this?
So people do generally see Nisman as having been assassinated. And this eventually, like, the timing was so strange that this eventually did really become hegemonic, even on the left and center left. So, Alberto Fernandez, the, very milquetoast kind of center left president at the moment, has said he believes Nisman was killed. Cristina Kirchner herself said at one point that she believed Nisman was killed. And of course, in their version, the suspect is Jaime Stiuso, who did this to pin it on the art, or I mean, it doesn't even have to be Stiuso. It could be like Iranian or Hezbollah agents, but it wasn't them. And it was, someone who did it to make the government look bad. On the right, obviously, the hegemonic narrative is this way. And certainly the narrative that's more received in North America is Cristina Kirchner did this because he was going to testify against her and, blow her whole Iran scheme. There's a couple of problems with this. The biggest one is that Nisman's indictment of CFK turned out to be essentially a nothing burger. Like, the Argentine courts ruled after his death that, there's just, nothing of substance in this. This is sort of, rambling, like very hastily and sloppily constructed, like, it didn't amount to anything. And, the fact that Jaime Stiuso had no confidence in it might probably also be a tell. Aside from that, in terms of the physical evidence and like which again, I'm not an expert on, but an Argentine journalist, very good, Pablo Dugan, wrote a very concise, good book called Who Killed Nisman about this, where he points out that, like, however weird the suicide is, there's like absolutely no evidence that Nisman was assassinated. So we know his mental state was like very panicky and precarious. He believed he was going to lose, everything he had. He had also had a big falling out with his ex-wife and with his children, like right before he returned to Argentina to sort of, from their vacation together, to sort of write all this stuff up. And then also there's just like all of his apartment doors were locked from the inside. There's no evidence, there was no forensic evidence of any kind of struggle. It's true, people trot out, like the biggest thing people trot out is like, oh, there was no gunpowder residue on Nisman's hand, but he used like a 22, which sometimes doesn't leave that. Again, it's very much not a like 2 shots to the back of the head situation. It's like, his body was blocking the bathroom door. Like there's no signs that a third party was in the apartment at all. He had also told his bodyguards and his friends, like early in the evening before, like, don't bother me, supposedly because he was writing up his indictment. But, there's more, it certainly seems overwhelmingly more likely on the weight of evidence that Nisman did, in fact, kill himself. He had a motive, and there's like no real reason to believe otherwise other than the timing.
Yeah, and you'd figure if it were the other way, someone could at least present like some strand of evidence, not just, the absence of evidence with the gunpowder residue hypothesis.
Oh, the other thing I should mention here is that a few days before his death, Nisman asked to borrow that he didn't own it. He didn't own the handgun that he used to kill himself. He requested to borrow it from his aforementioned IT guy, Diego Lagomarsino, who like is like, you don't know how to use a gun. Like, what the fuck do you want with this? And Nisman's like, oh, like I need to protect my daughters or some shit. So again, this is the gun. This is without doubt the weapon that killed him. And, he had asked to borrow it. That shows, again, that makes it, the suicide narrative quite plausible.
Yeah, your characterization of Nisman, all said and done, not that he was like this guy playing at the highest echelons of like international power or this like wily asset of American or Israeli intelligence, but just like sort of like a skeezy, weird guy who like may have gotten in over his head with a few things. I did think it was weird that like with his American bank account that no one knew about until after his death, that there apparently, you said there were large deposits that came from an unknown source, but even then it's just like, that doesn't necessarily mean he was on the payroll of Mossad or the CIA for that matter. I thought that thing that you put in about his association with that scumbag like model agency guy was sort of more pertinent than anything.
Yeah, so this is something that, to my knowledge, has only been written about in Spanish, which is Nisman's sort of big hobby after his divorce was fucking much younger women, who he would like aggressively, again, there's sort of hints that he had some kind of like, there was something like sexually pathological, in his life, like with the obscene phone call incident. But he would like show pictures of himself with these much younger women in bed in Cancun or in Miami to his friends really aggressively. They would be like, grossed out, like, as any 50-year-old would be if their 50-year-old friend tried to show them this. Like,
that's an amazing move to do, just as like a middle-aged man with kids. Like, look, I'm having sex.
And the way Nisman was meeting these women was through a guy he knew named Leandro Santos, who ran a model agency, as you said, but was also wanted in Uruguay, I think still is, for prostitution of minors, and who in 2021 was charged for making violent threats against one of the girls that Nisman had been with, to be like, don't mention me, Leandro Santos, in your testimony. So, was Nisman like, buying high-class prostitutes? Was he just, kind of scummy and getting this creepy friend to like hook him up with like, because Santos probably was a pimp, but he, did run a legitimate modeling agency. I don't think it's really that important. I wouldn't want to, I think the characterization to come away with Nisman from this is like, yeah, you can characterize him as like a, sexual deviant and a fiend, but the one that I think is just like more germane is just like, yeah, he was like a playboy. He liked fucking and like showing, and like telling people he fucked and was rich. Like, this sort of shows his kind of mind, and like he was not like playing at the highest levels. The only other thing I will mention about Nisman, though, that may contradict that is that the only party who received a copy of the indictment prior to his death was the U.S. Embassy in Buenos Aires, which again, like with his American bank account, is like, okay, yeah, he was obviously like in very deep with like, a lot of very like high level international machinations, but like, does that prove that he himself was like more than sort of, a tool or like a, an employee of greater forces? I don't really think so.
Yeah. So just to wrap it up, what was the fallout after Nisman's death? What were the consequences for Kirchner, and where does that leave us today?
So after Nisman's death, as I mentioned, there was this huge political firestorm that was like CFK killed him. Mauricio Macri, like one of the least charismatic men in history, wins the Argentine presidency from the right after Nisman's death. And in that case, probably it did have something to do politically. And it just like really intensifies the like firestorms and divides in Argentine society that are like, CFK is like this demon, like, really like Satan incarnate. Like, I have family members who feel like hostile to CFK really beyond ideology, I would say, who are like, she's a criminal, she's a murderer. And it gets sort of used for that. I would say it also does resurrect the Hezbollah Latin America narrative more broadly. Not that it ever went away, but like there's certainly like a big like bloom in think tank reports about like that time Iran blew up a synagogue in Argentina, and what it says about like Iran could be in Venezuela, or Hezbollah is running drug trafficking networks, and Hezbollah is like going to cross the U.S.-Mexican border, and Hezbollah is in Brazil. And it all refers back to the central incident. And the fact that Nisman died, in admittedly like a very strange manner, or at least with very strange timing, like has really, really did help to kick that into overdrive, and still does sort of come up. In the wake of Nisman's death, obviously Jaime Stiuso is no longer at CIDE. CIDE is also abolished and replaced with a new intelligence agency, and they purge all the top leadership. But again, like a lot of the guys in it are still, and the AFI, the new intelligence agency, are still the same people. And more to the point, like I think what Stiuso's career reveals is that like Stiuso worked with presidents across the political spectrum in Argentina, and his way of, making himself useful was he would, show up on Inauguration Day and say, Aldo Styles at your service. And then he would give, he would help with his network in the judiciary and in different state organs to sort of, smooth things out for people. The Kirchners were also very much indulged Stiuso in this and used him for this, especially Christina's husband and predecessor, Nestor Kirchner. And so this is the way that, I think intelligence functions in Argentina, and maybe, in the third world or in Latin America more broadly, is like, in the US, it's also the case, like politicians rely on these sorts of weird operators for like short-term interest. And there are, much bigger things going on. These people are working for larger forces and for themselves, and don't really have the national interest at heart. And I think that whoever wins tomorrow, that's something to keep in mind. But with reference to the elections tomorrow, I'd also just mention Argentina, again, there's sort of like, it's not well known. The Peronism Nazi thing colors people's view about it a lot. But Argentina has a very like sovereigntist left-wing political tradition. It's not like Colombia, where like Gustavo Petro is like literally like David fighting Goliath. Like, and so to deconstruct that, just these omnipresent sort of threat narratives and so forth have been put forward. Now, I don't think if Milei wins tomorrow, it's the end of that tradition, that great tradition in Argentine history. But I guess the real takeaway from AMIA is like, sort of the narrative subversion against Latin American sovereignty and for U.S. imperialism in Latin America, rather than the links to Iran, to the Middle East, which are like, it's less clear if these are just a tool to do stuff in Latin America or if these are like, there was really something going on with these because they haven't panned out into literally anything.
And is there anything more you'd like to add before we wrap up?
I've told my friend Miroslav I would do this. We do bi-weekly Twitter spaces called Regime Radio. That may become a podcast at some point. Come check those out. We're doing one next week with our buddy MJB about Palestine that I'm looking forward to a lot.
All right. Well, we will have links in the description that can guide people to that, your Substack and your Twitter. Thank you so much, Stef.
Thanks. This was I'm really glad to have told this story in this format. I think it lends itself much better.
No, I'm really happy we did this.
The other thing I would mention is that my AMIA series is not done yet. I'm just sort of juggling a lot. So I do intend to sort of explain a bunch of other things like the Syria theory, which we didn't manage to get to, or just like a fuller biography of Jaime Stiuso. So those will come at some point if people are interested, just, probably not in like the next few weeks.
All right. Yeah, definitely looking forward to that. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.